Okay, so welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be discussing the revised early years framework. We have over 140 colleagues joining us, colleagues with a range of roles, teachers, senior leaders, lead practitioners and advisors, and from a range of schools across the country, both NACE member schools and non-member schools. So a warm welcome to you all. We're so delighted that so many of you are joining us. And I think that the large numbers here give us an obvious sign that we're really wanting to engage and discuss all things early years and this unique year ahead. And for me, that includes me, an excuse to talk all things early years. So a real warm welcome to you all. Let me introduce a little bit about NACE that are hosting our webinar today. NACE is an independent charity dedicated to supporting schools to develop high quality provision for more able learners, but within a context for challenge for all. At NACE, we believe that all learners, regardless of background, should have their abilities recognised and have the opportunity to realise their full potential. NACE offer resources and support through CPD, working with leaders and practitioners across all sectors, contexts and phases, including the early years. So before we begin, let me run through the format of today's webinar. It's going to run for 45 minutes, and this will include a time for question and answers. Lots of you have submitted these in advance, but there will be a chance for you to submit these via the question and answer box in the webinar. And there's also a chat space for you all to share ideas, or maybe there's some themes that are coming up that you want to discuss further or reflect on as discussions today evolve. So let me introduce myself first of all. I'm Emma Tibbitts and I am NACE's Early Years Curriculum Advisor, which means I lead on the development of early years training programmes and resources. I've recently authored the NACE's Early Years Resource Set. I'll be talking a little bit more about this at the end of the webinar and give you some tips on how you can get your hands on those if that's something you're interested in. But generally, my background has seen over a decade's experience of teaching and leading across the primary phase, including early years, and I've held positions such as head of school, vice principal, and held a position as an early years consultant across a large federation of schools in London. But you're not here to hear about me. I'm going to introduce Dr Julian Grenier now, very much man of the moment, and absolutely delighted that you have joined us today, Julian. So a warm welcome to you. For those of you that don't know about Julian, he is the head teacher of Sheringham Nursery School and Children's Centre in Newham, East London. I've actually had the pleasure of meeting Julian a few years back now in person, where I visited his wonderful school, and I do have the pleasure of visiting so many early year settings across the country, and I'm not just saying this, but Sheringham really does stick out in my mind as a centre of excellence from the, the child-centred practice and research-led practice there, and outstanding provision of learning. So it was great to meet you back then, Julian, and it's great to work with you again today. But more recently, despite over 20 years experience in the early years sector and a doctorate in education, Julian has been appointed the author of the new Development Matters, the 2020 revised Development Matters, and is here today to help us unpick what this means, to reassure us of some of the changes and potential misconceptions that maybe we have formed regarding the content of the documentation and how it is intended for us to use as practitioners. So before we hear from Julian, I sent out a survey to capture ahead of the webinar today where colleagues felt the current CPD needs are within their earlier settings, and we're going to be exploring that at the end in more detail. So I think it will be interesting to see that across the wider schools that we have joining us today. But let's have a look at the feedback that we've had on today's hot topic on how prepared people feel for the implementation of the new framework. And we can see from the graph here that the majority of the responses received reflect a real sense of feeling a bit uncertain or not very well prepared. So this is where I'm going to hand over to you, Julian, and it'll be great for you to kick us off. Tell us a little bit about your background and why you've spent the last 20 years in early years, but an overview of these key changes and how you came to be involved with leading on the revision of the early years framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Emma. That was really a very generous introduction. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes now about the changes to the EYFS and try and touch on some of those things that Emma said, but obviously within 15 minutes, it's more going to be things to touch on and think about rather than a comprehensive overview. So I'm just going to share my screen, which is always a moment of slight anxiety for me. So here we go. So just some thoughts here, hopefully to cover Emma's brief here about the revised EYFS. And I guess also just to clarify that although I've got a nice thank you from the DFE at the end of Development Matters, it was actually a team effort and lots of people were involved in writing the document. So let's get this going. So just a very quick overview of what the key changes to the EYFS are taking effect in September 2021, unless you were an early adopter and you've been working with these changes all year. There are new early learning goals, which have been designed to be simpler to assess. So they're written in more straightforward English. And the idea was that instead of the early learning goals kind of dominating the reception curriculum for the whole year, we should put assessment in its correct place in our system, and a summative assessment like the ELGs really should be very carefully but also briskly completed in the first half of the summer term so that it takes its place but doesn't drive and dominate everything we're doing for the whole year in reception. The exceeding level has been taken out of the ELGs and there's no required external moderation anymore. So I'll talk a little bit more about this area of what happens to exceeding a bit later in the presentation and in the Q&A, I'm sure too. But the second point I'd make really is about external moderation, which is that we shouldn't take from that it doesn't matter anymore. It's just part of that direction of travel, which says it's for schools to make decisions which are going to work for them around things like moderation. So it's in everyone's interests that the assessments are accurate. And we need professional development where we challenge each other's judgments. But it's just that there isn't a legally prescribed moderation process anymore. And I'd say the same thing about characteristics of effective learning. It's not legally required anymore that we report on them because schools struggled with the legal requirement. But I think any school would be daft not to talk to a parent about how well their child is learning as well as what they've learned. But it just means that it's up to us to make those decisions now. There's more detail now in the educational programs in the statutory framework. They're often called now the skeleton of what children should be experiencing, learning about, the skills they should be developing. So those are now detailed a little bit more in the educational programs, but that really is a skeleton, and it's for us as practitioners then to elaborate the curriculum for our own children from those bare bones, if you like. And something that's important for me here, so I'm just going to add it, is the requirement to promote oral health, because a lot of our kids here in Newham have really poor oral health. And that pain of untreated cavities, the necessity to get teeth removed, actually gets in the way a lot for those children. It's painful and it's unpleasant. So I'm really pleased to see that. And we have a toothbrushing program here, which is on pause at the moment, but it's really helped improve children's oral health a great deal. There's also the revised development matters, which Emma talked about, the non-statutory guidance from the department. And again, I think just to highlight 5 things about it. First of all, it's quite a bit shorter. It's about 2/3 of the length of the original development matters. It's also written in more straightforward language. So it's about a 90-minute read. One of the surprises really of talking to practitioners as part of this job was that almost no one had ever read the non-statutory guidance as a single document. They just read slices of it. But unless you read the whole document, you don't really get the big picture of the guidance. So I'd really recommend people take 90 minutes out in one go, or 3.5 hours or whatever, and just read the document. It's much more straightforward now. The key objectives: more support for early communication, because it's communication that is the foundation of children's thinking, making friends, stating their needs, saying how they feel, playing. Everything really rests on that foundation of communication, which is somewhat neglected in our system, both in the early years and later phases of learning too. A child's communication at 5 is very strongly associated with how well they'll be doing at school when they're 11. So it's nuts for us to put a lot of focus on early literacy, for example, in reception, without putting the same focus on children's communication. Communication is really important at every stage in a child's schooling. Reducing workload. So I talked a bit about, for example, the changes to the ELGs. There was widespread recognition that people work really hard in the early years, but felt that a lot of their work was to do things that they wouldn't themselves choose to be doing. So we put lots and lots of time and effort, for example, into tracking and data and preparing for Ofsted. But those aren't the things that will make a difference to our children. So Ofsted have been really clear about not having any, not only no expectation around early years data, but actually saying that they won't look at any internally generated data in the early years at all when they're out on inspection. There's specific guidance for the reception year. And I'm just going to talk a bit about equalities next, because that's really the answer to Emma's question of both why I wanted to do this and to some degree why the DFE asked me to do it as well. So Becky Francis, CEO of the Education Endowment Foundation, puts it really well, that once children fall behind, and she's talking here about normal times, not the pandemic, and she's talking about the end of the EYFS, it's hard for them to catch up. They're likely to fall further behind throughout school. So in general, the gaps that emerge in the early years grow as children go through our school system. And that's really concerning when we think about equalities. This is a bit of an empty soundbite and it can be problematic, but I'll still share it with you, that it's much easier to help children keep up than help them catch up. So that's where our emphasis should be. Unfortunately, we live in a country where how well off your family is very predictive of how well you'll be doing by the end of the EYFS. So between the introduction of the last EYFS in 2012 and the last year that we've got data for, 2019, you can see that in the context of rising outcomes, the gap between children eligible for free school meals and the rest has remained roughly the same, widening a little bit in 2019. And that is fundamentally wrong. Half my family are from Canada, and in Canada, that link between how well off your family is and how well you do in school is nowhere near as strong. It doesn't have to be like this, but it is like this in our country. And it can't be that the most capable children are all in more affluent households. That it cannot be the case. We're definitely getting something wrong in the early years when we look at those figures. Very similar disadvantages also can be seen if we look at some groups of children by ethnicity. So huge gaps for Gypsy, Roma, traveller of Irish heritage children. We really haven't got anywhere in promoting equalities for those important communities. But Pakistani children, that gap is enormous. Black Caribbean children, another really significant gap. So there's a strong disadvantage baked into our system for children from certain ethnicities as well. And that's the big picture. So we all know that at an individual child level, we know lots of Pakistani kids or Black Caribbean kids or kids who get free school meals who are doing really well, and good on them, and good on all the practitioners and the families for doing that. So I'm not saying this is true at individual child level, but the bigger picture is a disgraceful failure to promote equalities. And I know that everything can't come down to early years education and care. It's complex, but we can do things in the space of early education and care to promote equality. And I'm just going to very briefly talk about some of the promising aspects of research where we're looking at things which are good for all children, but especially good for disadvantaged children. So high quality early childhood education and care is good for every child, but it's especially good for disadvantaged children. So it has a disproportionately positive effect. Working with parents to support children's learning. Having high expectations and beliefs. So where practitioners have poor expectations, either of how well parents will support children or of how well children will do, those expectations translate very readily into realities for the children. But the opposite is also true, that when we have high expectations that parents will, if we get our communication right with them, support their child's learning, that they do want the best for their child, that their kids are really capable, then those expectations and belief quickly translate themselves into realities for the children. So it's really important that, for example, because we meet a child in the early years who may not have had such rich early learning experiences as some of the other children, that doesn't mean that that child isn't going to be a very intelligent and highly capable learner. It just means that they haven't had some of those experiences, and they depend on us, perhaps, for those experiences. So if we let them down, there may not be a plan B for them. Self-regulation and executive function are looking really promising as spaces where the research is saying that if we can support development in those areas, it has lifelong benefits for children's learning. Similarly with metacognition, all the ways that we can help young children to think about their thinking and think about their learning, that makes them more powerful learners. And very interesting kind of emerging research suggesting that children's development in early numeracy is perhaps the most powerful indicator of how well they'll do later on in their schooling. And the team at Oxford University are running a project called Team Up, which is looking into all of those things at the moment. And all of those themes are reflected in our work as a research school. And if you go onto the Education Endowment Foundation's website, you can read about all of those aspects. So why was I selected to lead on this process, working with several hundred practitioners and other stakeholders and experts? Well, I think one of the things is that the Department for Education is really interested in two things about Newham, some of which have been led by Sheringham Nursery School's team and our work as a research school. One is the way that we've collaborated across the sector. So we have a group of over 100 private and voluntary nurseries, childminders and schools, all working collaboratively together to improve quality. Because we want to think about the children of Newham, not just the children in our school, not just our sector. So that's one interesting thing about Newham. And we were funded by Greater London Authority to do that work. Secondly, and I know that, again, geography and other factors play a big part in this. So I'm not trying to give a simplistic message, but Newham has got a really good track record around educational equality. So if we have a look at the EPI annual report 2020, we can see that in general, there are very big disadvantages faced by lower income children. But if we look at Newham, for example, the gap between disadvantaged children and the rest is really quite small, 0.8 months here. There's been a really strong focus on investment in early years, family support and children centre services, and a whole range of approaches which really prioritise the development and health and well-being of young children who are some of the poorest kids in England and living in some of the most overcrowded housing. And that decision by Newham, and also Newham's decision to work collaboratively across the sectors, and also Newham's decision, for example, through Every Child a Reader, to focus on research and evidence, all look like they're really paying off. Not only does that go well for children in the early years, but the disadvantage gap gets smaller as children go through their school. So this is not about some sort of artificial acceleration in the early years, which then peters out later. Those foundations serve our disadvantaged children in Newham really well. The gap actually gets smaller as the children go through their schooling. You know, again, don't overinterpret this statistic, but isn't it kind of exciting that a comprehensive in Newham, Brampton Manor, got more Oxbridge offers than Eton this year? You know, isn't that something to really be excited about? I'm excited about that. Because when I first came to work in East London in Tower Hamlets quite a few years ago, and I'm just going to apologise in advance for something offensive that was said to me here, but I'm going to relay it because it's important. The first thing my head teacher said to me in a primary school, which was largely made up of Bangladeshi children, was, where you train to be a teacher, those expectations aren't going to be right for here, because these children, they don't come from educated backgrounds. You're going to have to readjust what you expect of them. And sadly, I'm afraid lots of us did. And in that period, Bangladeshi children were some of the lowest attaining children in England. But what's exciting about Newham and Tower Hamlets is the drive led by people like Christine Gilbert and Kevin Collins to say, that is not okay, not okay. And now we see that the school system in Newham and Tower Hamlets has transformed itself from pretty much the worst in the country to one of the most effective. And that is about teacher belief and tackling the shameful prejudices and assumptions that are made. And one of my favorite kind of career anecdotes is getting a visit from a group of teachers from another part of England who came here to Newham. They looked at what we're doing here and at Sheringham Primary over the road. And at the end of the day, they said to me, you know, it's really great what you're doing here, but of course you've got the advantage of lots of Bangladeshi and Pakistani children. And I thought, how interesting. Who's in the firing line now for low expectations and low belief? Because when I started working in East London, it was exactly those communities of children. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about one of the changes that has caused a lot of discussion about the new EYFS and development matters, which is curriculum. And I'm going to go on to assessment with a few more thoughts. Laura, do signal to me if time gets too tight, won't you? So one of the things that is curious about early years education and childcare in England is that whereas we started in the year 2000 with curriculum guidance for the foundation stage, curriculum gradually drained out of our system till by 2012 it wasn't even mentioned at all as a concept in development matters. And that is quite unusual internationally. Internationally, people talk about curriculum. So the revised EYFS is saying to us as practitioners, we need to have that big picture. What is it we want our children to experience, know, and be able to do as a result of the time they spend with us? And that is going to be different according to where we're working. So it doesn't make sense to have an enormous lot of central government prescription and assume that that's right for everyone. It has to be right for the children in our communities. What's right for kids here in Sheringham won't be right for your kids wherever you are. The second thing that is central to this thinking about curriculum is secure learning. What are the things where we really need the children's learning to be secure by the end of the EYFS or by the end of the time they're with us, and where we're going to highlight if they're still learning in that area? So, for example, we know from some of the kind of really quite forensic assessment that's been done with older children around maths as a result of maths mastery approaches, for example, that many children in primary schooling a few years ago was surprisingly lacking in a really secure understanding of how number worked. And that tells us that we need to focus more on that in the early years. And that's why, for example, the recommendations on the size of numbers to use has gone down to 10, but there's much more emphasis on children's deep understanding. We need to give children plenty of time to practice, to rehearse, to become fluent, to love and enjoy being young mathematicians, rather than constantly racing children on to bigger numbers or newer concepts. I'm going to kind of skip down a bit here and in a moment talk a bit about assessment that supports children and helps improve learning and care, rather than what we have at the moment, which is often little thinking about curriculum and a lot of thinking about assessment and tracking, which is the wrong way around. So Iram Siroj from the School of Education at Oxford focuses on the importance of curriculum, supporting us to think clearly about our pedagogical aims, ensuring that we're mindful of progression for all of our children, focusing our attention and observation on the most important aspects of children's learning and of their development. And again, too often, what we see is that instead of thinking about those 3 points, we're very focused, if you like, on tracking what children are doing without thinking about our bigger picture first. And then things get very difficult. That's where you get, for example, workload issues in reception, where there's a huge focus on tracking towards the ELGs, but not enough focus on that enjoyable and ambitious curriculum for all the children. UNESCO also say that we need to have that big picture of the curriculum so that we interrelate development and learning processes. And also that can lighten our workload because it gives us guidance in the sorts of activities we should be offering our children. So Development Matters has been repurposed. Its purpose is not a long assessment tick list. Its purpose is guidance to help all of us in our unique and individual contexts put together the curriculum that will be right for our children. So many of the questions that come up around Development Matters are missing the fact that the guidance has been repurposed. And that's why it's been subheaded Curriculum Guidance for the Early Years Foundation stage. Let's just think about maths as an example of the importance of curriculum. So we know that a lot of the best learning in the early years is driven by children. It happens through play and through their independent exploration and all the work we do as practitioners to enable that independent learning to happen. And children's spontaneous play is very mathematical. So the researchers Clements and Sarama comment that there's a lot of mathematical content in children's freely chosen play and that we can build on those experiences. But they caution us importantly, those teachable moments alone are far from adequate. It's unrealistic for any of us to see opportunities for multiple children to build multiple concepts consistently over the year. We need to have a clear sense of what the secure understanding of early maths, of numeracy, what it is that we want our children to be secure in. And some of that will happen through the children's play spontaneously, and we can build on it. And that's great. But we can't assume that that will happen for every child every day. And the danger is that some children miss out. And we know who those children are, because that's where this presentation began, with the children that miss out. If we don't have that big picture, for example, of our early maths curriculum, interleaved with a focus on play and independent learning, if we don't have that, some children will still do okay, but not all of them, and that won't be good enough. So what sort of assessment makes a difference to children? In other words, if I do a lot of data analysis and tracking and photographing and evidence, that may serve some purposes, but it won't make any difference to any individual child's learning whatsoever. There are assessment practices that make children better learners and stronger learners. So for example, sustained shared thinking, I would argue, is an assessment practice, because if we're having that back and forth dialogue with a child where we're thinking together and solving a problem, we're assessing all of the time. We're noticing what they're saying to us. We're thinking through what it means about their understanding. And we're having that intellectual exploration together. We're following the child's train of thought. And I'm not going to go into great detail, but just Google sustained shared thinking if you're not clear about it. It is the feature of early years practice that is associated with the highest quality and the best outcomes for children. Scaffolding is an assessment technique that is hugely powerful for children, where we're very careful to see what children can do and where they could do a bit more if we gave them just a little bit of help. And our intention in giving them that help is to make them more independent. It's a fallacy to think that the way you make children independent learners is leaving them alone all of the time. And feedback, which is also a really powerful technique. So let's just have a quick think about what is helpful in the zone of assessment. Focusing on what's useful. So I'm not suggesting, and nor is Development Matters suggesting, that you just throw away your whole approach to assessment and start again. What it's saying is, use this as an opportunity to reflect on what's useful, preserve and protect what's useful, but there may be opportunities to say, actually, these practices aren't useful, or we used to do this for Ofsted, but now Ofsted don't want it, so we can stop doing it now. It is important to establish children's starting points. It's really important to use assessment to guide our professional judgment, but not replace it. And we should be making proportionate choices that help us to be better teachers and better carers for all of our children. Emma, am I okay for time?
We've been quite ambitious with how much we are trying to squeeze in, but I know assessment particularly is something that is really on everyone's agenda. So yeah, but if we move in the next couple of minutes onto the questions, that would be great. Thanks, great. Julian.
Okay, so one of the things we've been thinking about here quite a bit as a result of the EYFS work on SEND is the difference between scaffolding up or differentiating down. So the EPSI project, which is a very big research project into effective early years, found that where children are seen to be struggling, in general, we don't focus our attention on helping them to access the main curriculum that we're offering all children, but we offer them a different curriculum, which I call differentiating down, more focus on activities to promote PSED, more creative activities. I'm not damning those activities, but I'm commenting that if children aren't taking part as well in activities that support their early numeracy and their early literacy and all the other rich curriculum we have on offer, they're missing out, and we know what the result of that will be. The EF guidance for teaching assistants has a really great bit about scaffolding. So I'm not going to talk you through the diagram, which is adapted on the right, but what I would say is that scaffolding is a really powerful technique for helping all children access the curriculum. It doesn't matter if a child needs a lot of help to access the curriculum, as long as they have got a foothold of accessing it, and we can gradually reduce that help. But what is important is that all of our children are involved in the same curriculum so that they're learning alongside each other. That's really an important value for me. I'm just going to show a very brief video clip, and then I will finish, about feedback. So this is a clip some of you will know, and I've just taken a slice out of it. And it's about Austin's butterfly. You can Google it. It's on YouTube. And I think it gives us a really neat example of how feedback, that minute-by-minute assessment, could really help to improve children's learning. Some of the children here are older than early years, but I still think it's a powerful video, and it opens with reception-aged kids, kindergartners. Okay, that's actually the wrong video. So I'm going to skip it, which will save us a bit of time. But Google Austin's butterfly if you want to see a really nice bit of video about feedback, which I'll put in the chat in a bit.
Great. Thank you so much, Julian. As I mentioned just briefly a second ago, we've been incredibly ambitious today. There is so much that we could talk about. I'm sure people are buzzing in the room with different things that you've said there. And I think for me, it's just really fascinating and reassuring to hear how much research has gone into the changes that have been made and where some of those decisions have come from. And you've touched on assessment, which is something that's come up again through the questions that were submitted prior to this session. And I think those key messages there around sort of that less paperwork and more time with the children, and it's really useful to hear how our assessment needs to be focused and useful, and reassuring practitioners there to adapt practice where it maybe hasn't been useful and it has added to their workload and taken them away from being beside the children in their learning. I'm having a few more questions come through specifically though about the reception year, because there is still this nervousness around the changes in this transition, but particularly around the statutory reception baseline assessment. The data obviously isn't shared with practitioners once the children have completed it. So what would you say, or how would you advise schools should be baselining children entering reception without these age sticking bands?
So yeah, that's a really good question, and it is a separate question to baseline assessment. Yes. And I think the quick answer to that is, in that bullet point, focus on what's useful. What is it you need to know about the children when they come in? So I would say that these are the things I would want to know about children coming in, actually at most stages of the early years, but particularly reception. You know, their confidence in making a new relationship. How well do they move from the parent to the practitioners in reception class? How well do they make new relationships with other children, get stuck in, start to play and learn alongside them? Communication, have they got the communication to play, to make friends, to say what they need or want, to listen and follow instructions where necessary? That's important. Field development, you've got all that love equipment for large motor skills, small motor skills, can use it or not. And self-help, things like eating, drinking, dressing and undressing, code, toileting. Those are things I'd want to know. Why? Because these children, given support that's appropriate during the settling in phase and high quality learning environment and staff who are responsive to them, they'll have some ups and downs, but they'll settle into reception well. And very soon they're accessing your curriculum and things are going well for them. But there's going to be some children for whom that's not the case. So you need to know really quickly, who are those kids? Where are their barriers? Are there barriers, physical development or social emotional barriers or communication barriers? How can you really quickly give them intensive support, work with their parents, help them get to the place where they too are accessing the curriculum you've got on offer alongside the other children? So for me, what's useful is to get the information we need to focus our efforts where they'll make the biggest difference. And you just saying to me, 33% of my kids are well below expected on entry, doesn't give any insight into the help those children need at an individual child level to do well and to thrive. And equally for the children who quickly settle in and are doing really well, we need to think about how our environment and everything we're offering and the teaching is ambitious and exciting for those children. So think about formative assessment at individual child level that will help you to be a better teacher, practitioner, carer. That's what I would focus on.
Thanks, Julian. That's super helpful. And yeah, I think just that what I'm taking away is that that focus on the word useful. What is useful and what is going to have the biggest impact on the children's development, those gaps, and identifying those early. I still think there's a bit of a debate, and educational practitioners at the moment reviewing some of the practices that maybe they've loved or not loved so much in terms of workloads, things like collating sort of evidence through learning journals, or using some of those online systems to record and share. So I guess there's a bit of work within individual schools to have those conversations, and that relationship between practitioners and senior leaders to be on the same page and making those decisions together around what the assessment procedures are going to look like within their schools. And you know, you mentioned in your first opening talk as well around moderation as one of the key changes, but it's great, obviously, you know, and really wanted to highlight what you said around, although there's no statutory requirement anymore, of course there's still a real value in some, it can be useful in terms of collaborating, staff collaborating together across that wider network, sharing best practice and supporting each other in their judgments that they're making. So it's really important to identify that although it's not statutory, it would be useful. Would you suggest, Julian, that, you know, within schools there is that moderation still happening where possible?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's again about two things, I think, about effectively managing this change. You know, first of all, just think clearly about what's useful. Look at things like the Early Years Toolkit on the Education Endowment Foundation to start your conversation about what sort of practices in early years have impact for children and what doesn't. Don't change everything. The first week in September should not be a revolutionary week for early years. Think about what you do well already and protect and preserve that. Think about the opportunities. Obviously, make sure you're in line with the statutory framework. Have a credible plan to be in line with that framework in the year 2021 to 22. You know, pilot things at small scale, implement changes sensibly. Yeah. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yeah. I think that's incredibly reassuring, I'm sure, for everybody listening along. As I say, really conscious of the time. I wish we could talk about this all day, but I really wanted to just pick up on, as we sort of work through the next set of questions, you talked a lot about, and it's so refreshing to hear these, you know, the high expectations for all, and quite rightly, you know, identifying the impact that having high expectations, what it has on the learner. And I think, you know, at NACE particularly, that's one of the core principles, having these high expectations for, because we know through research, as you've mentioned, the impact that it has on their learning. And you talked a lot about sort of the disadvantaged groups, and rightly so. But in the new framework, and teachers are going to be expected to continue to identify and stretch more able children. How are we expecting this to happen, and how will we know that they've been stretched, I guess, is the first part of the question. And the second part being, is there a danger potentially that some of the planned opportunities around challenge now could be overlooked or seen as not as important in response to the removal of the exceeding band? So what are your views on that? Thinking of all pupils, identified the disadvantage, but quickly thinking about those disadvantages as well that fall into the more able camp.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, because I was looking at a school that was talking about, you know, something like, for their most able children will be working well beyond the nursery curriculum at the point at which they transition into reception. Well, I hope they won't be, to be totally blunt about it, because a mastery approach to learning, and I hesitate to say that because of the kind of gendering of it, but this is about really making sure that all children, to the very best of our ability, are secure in the key concepts and skills that we want them to be secure in. And where children are faster to become secure, then what we're doing is we're deepening their learning, we're offering them real world problems, we're getting them to feedback and support the learning of other children. We're not moving on into new and different curriculum, because we're not planning to give the next teacher up the line 3 different classes all within 4 walls. That's an impossible job for any teacher to take on. And that's where we get the problem with what I call differentiating down, and that spiral that goes downwards for some children. And what are the advantages in that system for children who pick things up more quickly? Well, one of the advantages is that I think one of the biggest drags for those children, often in our education system, is being in a classroom with other kids who are really disaffected because they're not accessing the mainstream curriculum. They're already feeling like they're not doing well, and they're only 5 years old or 6 years old. High-performing education systems focus on holding groups of children together, accessing a curriculum that is common to all of them, but some children getting more support and scaffolding than others. And that, to me, is the promising direction for our system to go in. You know, where children haven't understood something that is important for them to understand, let's really quickly help them keep up that day, early the next morning, during assembly time that day, whenever we can, because helping children through extra scaffolding to keep up is so much more impactful than getting assessment data down the line and sending them into catch-up interventions that probably won't work anyway. And all children benefit from that inclusive curriculum. And that is what we see in high-performing educational systems.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think another aspect of this sort of a string to the bow really is I'm really thrilled to see the emphasis, the revised emphasis on the spoken language and the early communication. As you've discussed, and we know that, you know, research heavily suggests the impact of high classroom discourse, especially for our disadvantaged pupils. But again, what about those pupils that come in potentially with such high levels of language? And how do you think practitioners can support this? Is it more of the mastery approach? It's more going into the depth. You know, what sort of language are we thinking of exposing these learners to? And is there somewhere you could guide practitioners to within development matters on that or elsewhere?
Yeah, sure. So have a look at sustained shared thinking,
Yeah.
which is where we have an extended conversation with the child, where we really, in a kind of Socratic way, build on and engage with their thinking. So we don't introduce like the correct answer to the child, but we just keep stimulating them to ask another question or investigate another thought. Now, you're not going to be able to do that very often in a busy early years environment, and it doesn't have to be done often, but little in terms of frequency, but depth and length of the conversation are really impactful. And what I've noticed is that not only is that really exciting for a lot of children whose communication is really solid, but other children around who may not be able to have that level of fluency in a thoughtful conversation yet still benefit from that sort of discourse being in the air. They chip in bits,
Absolutely.
even if they don't have the extended conversation themselves. So think about sustained shared thinking. It's a really powerful teaching technique that benefits all children.
Now, that's incredibly useful. I think, you know, thinking of the sustained shared thinking as an example, there might be lots of people listening think, oh, I want to know more about that. And we know through the revised framework, there's much more emphasis on high quality CPD, another thing I'm delighted to see. And in my experience, early years practitioners often, not intentionally, but get missed out on some of that CPD because often in schools, they're down in their little bubble getting on with things. And, you know, I don't think they're so busy, they're not often included maybe in some of those CPD opportunities. So I guess for senior leaders to recognise the importance of that high quality CPD across all the way down to the early years. But asking you specifically, Julian, as a successful head teacher of an outstanding research school, just I guess inspire us a little. How would you explain the impact of high quality CPD on teaching and learning that you've seen in your school?
So, I mean, first of all, I think acknowledge and try and be humble about the fact that a lot of what we try and do, both in CPD and school development, you know, doesn't go brilliantly. It's much messier than it sounds when people give you the kind of PR spin. But these would be the principles, I'd say. First of all, I would definitely draw on the EEF Schools Guide to Implementation as an excellent guide. What are the key messages of that? First of all, spend much more time than we usually do in the explore and prepare phases. So look to the evidence, look carefully at how well you're doing, use accurate self-evaluation, pick the topic of your professional development carefully, think about running that for a 6 to 12 month period, evaluating and monitoring as you go, think about the mentoring and coaching elements you're going to use, think about the points at which you're going to see how something is going and you're going to adjust, drop some things, put more emphasis on other things. Do less, but do it better.
Yeah.
Now that's really brief, but the free book I've written about the new EYFS, the Principles into Practice book, which people can download for free, that has a whole section on effective professional development. But if there were 2 sound bites, it would be do less and do it better, and think 6 to 12 months. Don't think that you're going to train multiple staff in multiple areas and they're going to cascade it back and you're going to develop brilliant practice across the board. You know, pick one thing that you're really going to major on and do that really well. Great.
Thank you so much. So earlier on, at the beginning of the webinar, I mentioned that I sent out a survey around addressing and getting practitioners to reflect on what they felt their current CPD priorities are within their school. And I thought it would just be really, while we're talking about CPD now, just really good and maybe insightful for everybody to have a quick glance at the responses of this. And obviously you can see there, we've already covered that now, or most of it, around preparing for the implementation of the early years framework, but there's some other sort of key focuses coming through the early years there around what people feel they would like support with in terms of planning and setting up open-ending challenging learning activities and that sort of classroom environment and practice around wider challenging opportunities for all, high expectations for all. And just as we sort of come to a close, because I wish we had more time, I really do, I feel like we've only just touched the surface on so many of these things. But to thank you, Julian, for sharing what you have with us this afternoon, been really clear on some key messages to take away on the implementation of the new framework, where practitioners need to be focusing the changes around, and not, you know, as you said, not throwing the baby out of the bathwater, you know, slowly. And, you know, I'm sure the vast majority of the schools are doing things brilliantly already, and it's just that tweaking and ensuring that the child is at the centre. We're not being overwhelmed with historical tick boxing tasks or checklists and drowning in paperwork. So I know that with my NACE hat on, I'm just going to share with practitioners that are joining us today of an up and coming course that really sort of address how practitioners can identify and support the needs of more able learners within the early years setting. So really focusing on high expectations, and I'm talking for all learners, inclusive of all, so they can all achieve their full potential. And there's a 3-part early years course coming up that I'll be running, and the dates are on screen there. And if you go to the NACE website, there's information on how you can sign up, because we'd love to have lots of you come along and extend the conversation that we've really just touched upon and started today. The course is designed to be really interactive. It's in 3 parts, but there's lots of sort of in-between gap tasks to undertake, so that we're really coming together as a team of early years practice to share best practice and to support each other in the developing practice, particularly in the up and coming changes in September. So it'll be great if that sounds like something that you'd be interested in, to follow the link and to sign up. And as I say, in the last part of the 3-part course, we'll really be continuing these conversations and looking ahead to September. So unless, Laura, there is anything else from you that you need to add in there, or I've missed anything out, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining today. I said it a million times, but I really wish we had so much more time, but it's just great to come together. And Julian, thank you so much for your time and for giving us your pearls of wisdom. I'd love to ask you about your toothbrushing regime. It sounds exciting. I'm sure lots of people are thinking, oh, I'd love to know about that. So maybe you can end with a pearl of wisdom on tell us how shiny everyone's teeth are in your school.
Well, I'll tell you three quick things. First of all, that don't all relate to that. First of all, I've answered some of the other questions from the webinar by text. So if you're checking the chat function and you put a question in that wasn't answered verbally, I've answered it in the text. Secondly, I've done my very best to share lots of information for free with people, both through the free book and through my blog. Yeah. So if you kind of use Google, like you're all brilliant at doing, you can find that stuff, and you can either find it useful or violently disagree with me, whatever you're feeling like, but it's all out there and it's free for people to access. Toothbrushing, we worked with our local public health colleagues. It's what's called dry toothbrushing, which sounds rather disgusting, which is, you know, there's no swilling of water or anything. There are just tissues, and children have individual toothbrushes that are kept clean and secure, and they all brush their teeth together in the session and spit it out into a tissue. They are remarkably good at doing that, which sounds rather horrid to me, and their dental health as a result of that in this community is transformed. And that's why I would end on this note. You know, we can't solve everything in the early years, but we can solve more things than almost any other sector of the school system. Yeah. So believe in what you can do to transform children's health and happiness and learning in the early years. And also believe in the real brilliance and genius of all of the children that are in your group, because there's just such incredible stuff we can do when we really put our belief in the children and the families. And when you hear people talking about these children or the problem with these families, or what can you expect from that parent, you know, it's rubbish. It's absolute rubbish, and take it on. It's generally offensive. It's generally class or race-based, and it's unacceptable. And we can do much better than this as educators.
Absolutely. Well, I think that that's a brilliant note to end on, and a brilliant message to end the session and to take away today. So thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you once again, Julian. Yeah, we'll look forward to hearing much more from you another time.